A captured enemy aircraft became the key that unlocked aerial dominance in the Pacific. One daring test pilot's mission with a stolen Zero transformed America's fighter program, turning the F6F Hellcat into a devastating force that would claim 19 enemy planes for every one lost. The tide of aerial warfare was about to shift dramatically. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The fog hung low over Akutan Island that June morning in 1942, shrouding the remote Aleutian landscape in a ghostly veil. Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga banked his Mitsubishi A6M0 sharply, the aircraft responding with the legendary agility that had made it the most feared fighter in the Pacific. The young Japanese pilot had been part of a routine patrol when American defenses caught them by surprise. A single bullet had found its mark, puncturing his oil line and sealing his fate. Koga knew he couldn't make it back to his carrier. The harsh reality of war left him with one option: find somewhere to put down his crippled machine. Through breaks in the fog, he spotted the marshy terrain of Akutan and made his decision. The Zero descended rapidly, its sleek frame gliding toward what Koga hoped would be a survivable landing. It wasn't. The aircraft's wheels caught in the soft, boggy ground, flipping the fighter onto its back. The impact was fatal for Koga, killing him instantly as the cockpit crumpled around him. Yet remarkably, the plane itself remained largely intact, its lightweight aluminum body nestled in the marsh like a sleeping predator. Circling overhead, Koga's wingmen faced an impossible choice. Military protocol demanded they destroy the downed aircraft to prevent its technology from falling into enemy hands. But the Bushido Code, the strict samurai warrior ethic they lived by, forbade them from desecrating their comrade's body. They couldn't bring themselves to strafe the overturned Zero with Koga still inside. After several tense passes over the crash site, the Japanese pilots reluctantly turned their aircraft back toward their carrier. Their act of mercy, honoring their fallen brother over military necessity, would prove catastrophic for Japan's air superiority in the Pacific. The Zero lay undisturbed in its marshy grave, its secrets intact. The fog closed in again, concealing the crash site from prying eyes. For weeks, the aircraft remained hidden, its pristine condition preserved by the cool, damp climate. Inside the cockpit, Koga's body remained with his aircraft, a silent guardian of Japan's most closely guarded aerial technology. No one in the Japanese high command could have predicted how this single crash would alter the course of the air war. The Zero, with its exceptional maneuverability, long range, and deadly armament, had been Japan's greatest advantage in the skies. American pilots had learned to fear the fighter's capabilities, often at the cost of their lives. Now, that advantage lay vulnerable in an Alaskan marsh, waiting to be discovered. The Americans had been desperate to capture an intact Zero since the war began. Through a twist of fate and a moment of human compassion, they were about to get their wish. The thick Alaskan fog had forced Lieutenant James Reeves and his crew in their PBY Catalina nearly 20 miles off their intended patrol route. Visibility had dropped to mere yards, forcing the flying boat to descend dangerously close to the treacherous terrain of Akutan Island. As the mist momentarily parted, Reeves spotted something unnatural among the waving marsh grass. A glint of metal that had no business being there. "Circle back," he ordered. Squinting through the side window, the patrol plane banked sharply, and as they came around, the fog thinned just enough to reveal their discovery. The unmistakable silhouette of an aircraft. Not just any aircraft, a Mitsubishi A6M0. The Navy crew landed their Catalina in a nearby bay and trudged through knee-deep mud to investigate. What they found left them speechless. Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga's fighter lay belly up in the marsh, its cockpit crushed, but the rest of the airframe remarkably intact. The soft, boggy ground had cushioned the impact, preserving the wings, fuselage, and most critically, the engine and control systems. "My God," whispered the navigator, running his hand along the distinctive red Hinamaru emblem. "It's practically undamaged." Within hours, encrypted messages raced from the remote island to naval headquarters in Alaska. Admiral Freeman's response was immediate and emphatic. "Secure site, absolute secrecy. Recovery team en route." The discovery electrified the American command. Intelligence officers who had only seen the feared Zero in blurry reconnaissance photos or fiery combat footage now had the prospect of examining one up close. This was the aircraft that had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor. Lighter, more maneuverable, and longer ranged than anything in the American arsenal. For 3 days, the Catalina crew camped beside the crash site, standing guard in driving rain and biting wind. They covered the aircraft with tarps and posted round-the-clock watches, knowing that if Japanese patrols discovered their find, they would certainly destroy it. When the recovery team finally arrived aboard a Navy transport ship, they brought specialists, equipment, and explicit orders. Every wire, every gauge, every scrap of metal is to be documented, photographed, and preserved. The team leader, a weathered commander with experience in aircraft salvage, surveyed the scene with barely contained excitement. "Gentlemen," he announced to his team, "what we learn from this machine might just change the course of the war." None of them could have known then how prophetic those words would prove, or that thousands of miles away, a test pilot named Eddie Sanders would soon find his destiny intertwined with this mud-caked trophy of war. The Aleutian fog hung like a wet blanket over Akutan Island as the Navy Seabees arrived aboard a hastily requisitioned fishing vessel. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Holloway surveyed the marshy terrain with a grimace. The Zero, their prize, lay half-buried in mud, its pristine white fuselage now stained with earth and grass. 6 inches deeper, and we might never have found it, he muttered to his second-in-command. The recovery team established a makeshift camp downwind of the crash site. Rain pelted their canvas tents mercilessly as they worked in rotating shifts. The men slogged through knee-deep mud, their boots creating sucking sounds with each laborious step. Every few hours, a lookout would scan the horizon for Japanese patrol aircraft. Their presence would mean certain death on this exposed island. "Careful with that wing section," barked Holloway, as 4 men struggled to lift the delicate aluminum structure. "That's worth more than all your paychecks combined." Each component required meticulous handling. The Zero's lightweight construction, the very feature that made it so deadly in combat, now proved both blessing and curse. The parts were easier to transport but dangerously fragile. Engineers photographed every connection before disassembly, creating detailed diagrams that would later prove invaluable to Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders and his team. The Mitsubishi engine received special attention. Naval intelligence had prioritized its recovery above all else, knowing that understanding its power-to-weight ratio would be crucial for developing countermeasures. The men wrapped it in oiled canvas, then constructed a custom wooden crate, padded with whatever materials they could scavenge. Nights on Akutan were tense affairs. The constant drone of generators powering their tools might attract unwanted attention, but the work couldn't wait. The men spoke in hushed tones around small fires, some wondering aloud about the pilot whose body they'd respectfully buried nearby. Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga had become, in death, an unwitting ally. After 3 grueling weeks, the dismantled Zero was finally ready for transport. The components, meticulously labeled, photographed, and packed, were loaded onto the same fishing vessel that had brought the recovery team. As they pulled away from Akutan's shore, several men glanced back at the disturbed earth where they'd found their prize. The journey south was tense but uneventful. Military escorts joined them at various points, maintaining radio silence throughout. When they finally reached San Diego, the morning sun glinted off the waters of the bay, a stark contrast to the gray skies they'd left behind. Naval Air Station North Island awaited. Its sunlit tarmac, the final destination for Koga Zero, and the beginning of a technical revolution that would change the course of the air war in the Pacific. The morning fog had just begun to lift over San Diego Bay as Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders stood on the tarmac, hands thrust deep in his pockets. His weathered face betrayed nothing, but his eyes never left the massive wooden crate being lowered from the transport plane. 6 weeks of rumors, classified briefings, and midnight phone calls had culminated in this moment. "Is that really it?" whispered a young ensign beside him. Sanders nodded silently. The test pilot's reputation for emotional restraint was well earned, but even he felt a flutter of anticipation as workers pried open the crate. Piece by piece, the disassembled Mitsubishi A6M emerged, the legendary Zero that had dominated Pacific skies for months. "My God," Sanders finally murmured, approaching the main fuselage section. He ran his fingers along the elegant aluminum skin, noting how thin it felt. The faded red Hinamaru, the rising sun emblem, was still visible on the wing section, a stark reminder of whose aircraft this had been. This wasn't just metal and wires. It was Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga's final legacy. "Commander, we need your signature." A naval officer thrust a clipboard toward him. The paperwork was extensive. This was now America's most valuable intelligence asset. Security around the hangar was unprecedented. Marines with Thompson submachine guns patrolled in pairs, checking identification 3 times before allowing anyone near the building. Floodlights illuminated the perimeter at night, and armed guards stood watch around the clock. "They're calling it Koga Zero now," explained the base commander, a portly captain with perpetual sweat stains. "Only 17 people on this entire base have clearance to see it." Sanders nodded, scanning the small team assembled before him. Engineers from Grumman, naval mechanics, and a handful of officers waited for instructions. His gaze settled on a quiet man standing slightly apart from the others. "You must be Nakamura," Sanders said, extending his hand. George Nakamura nodded, shaking it firmly. "Yes, sir. I understand you requested me specifically." "Your experience with Japanese engines might save us weeks of trial and error," Sanders replied. What he didn't mention was the background check Nakamura had endured, more thorough than anyone else's despite his impeccable service record. As the team began the painstaking reassembly process, Sanders circled the aircraft, taking mental notes. The Zero's reputation had grown to mythic proportions. American pilots spoke of it with dread and awe. Now, seeing its elegant lines and lightweight construction, the stakes became real. "We're going to learn every secret you have," he whispered to the aircraft. In his mind, American pilots were dying because they didn't understand this machine. That ended today. The cavernous hangar at Naval Air Station North Island fell silent as Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders ran his fingers along the Zero's aluminum skin. The metal yielded slightly under his touch, disconcertingly thin. "It's like tissue paper," he muttered, tapping the fuselage with his knuckle. The hollow sound confirmed his suspicions. George Nakamura nodded in agreement. The Japanese-American mechanic had become invaluable to the operation, his knowledge of Japanese engineering principles filling gaps that would have taken the Americans months to understand. "The Mitsubishi engine is designed for maximum power-to-weight ratio," Nakamura explained, his voice low as he leaned over the exposed power plant. "They sacrifice durability for speed and range." Sanders watched as the mechanic's practiced hands traced the fuel lines with reverence. Despite the initial wariness some team members had shown toward Nakamura, his expertise had quickly earned their respect. The man could read the aircraft like a book written in a language few Americans comprehended. Walter McIntyre, the young engineer from Grumman, circled the aircraft with a micrometer, measuring the fuselage skin at various points. His meticulous nature reminded Sanders of himself. The data McIntyre was gathering would prove crucial for the Hellcat's development back at Bethpage. "Sir, "You won't believe this," McIntyre called out, holding up the measuring tool. "The skin here is 0.02 inches, barely thicker than a dime." Sanders whistled softly. "And this is what's been terrorizing our boys in the Pacific?" The three men stood in contemplative silence, each processing the implications. The Zero represented a fundamentally different philosophy of aircraft design, sacrificing protection for maneuverability and range. "No self-sealing fuel tanks either," Nakamura pointed out, gesturing to the exposed fuel system. "One incendiary round in the right place, and the whole thing goes up like a match," Sanders finished. McIntyre scribbled furiously in his notebook. "If we can exploit these weaknesses, we need to understand its strengths first." Sanders interrupted. "This aircraft has dominated the Pacific for a reason." The test pilot climbed onto the wing, careful not to damage the fragile structure, and lowered himself into the cockpit. The controls felt alien under his hands, lighter, more responsive than the American fighters he was accustomed to. "The visibility is incredible," he remarked, scanning the horizon through the canopy. "And these controls, they're feather light." As the team worked through the night, a picture emerged of an aircraft of contradictions, beautiful yet fragile, lethal yet vulnerable. Sanders knew that understanding these paradoxes would be the key to defeating the Zero in combat. "Tomorrow," he announced as they finally broke for a few hours of rest, "we start figuring out how to outfight this thing." The tension inside Hangar 6 at Naval Air Station North Island was palpable. Just 3 days before Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders was scheduled to take Koga Zero on its maiden American flight, catastrophe nearly erased months of painstaking work. A Navy welder, working on reinforcing a damaged wing strut, momentarily looked away as a stray spark arced through the air. The tiny ember landed in a pile of oil-soaked rags that had been carelessly left beneath the Zero's delicate fuselage. Within seconds, flames began to climb, hungrily licking at the aircraft's paper-thin aluminum skin. George Nakamura spotted the danger first. The Japanese-American mechanic had been meticulously adjusting the Zero's carburetor when the acrid smell of burning fabric caught his attention. Without hesitation, he dropped his tools and lunged for the fire extinguisher mounted on the far wall. "Fire! Clear the hangar!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the usual mechanical din. Sanders, who had been reviewing flight plans with Walter McIntyre in the adjacent office, burst through the door just as Nakamura reached the growing blaze. The mechanic unleashed a powerful stream of chemical retardant, methodically sweeping the nozzle across the flames. His hands remained steady even as the fire threatened to spread to the irreplaceable aircraft. "Get that fuel card away from here." Sanders commanded 2 nearby technicians, who stood frozen in shock. The men snapped to attention, quickly wheeling the dangerous container to safety. Within 20 seconds, Nakamura had extinguished the fire, leaving behind a smoldering, acrid mess, but the Zero remained intact, saved by mere inches. "That was too damn close," McIntyre whispered, his face ashen as he surveyed the scene. The engineer ran his hand along the undamaged fuselage, relief evident in his trembling fingers. The base commander ordered an immediate security review. Guards were doubled and a new protocol was established. No welding or hot work would be permitted within 50 feet of the aircraft. Sanders personally inspected every inch of the captured fighter, searching for even the slightest damage. That evening, the test pilot found Nakamura meticulously cleaning soot from the Zero's landing gear. "You saved more than just an airplane today," Sanders said quietly. "You saved our best chance at beating these things in combat." The mechanic nodded solemnly. "My brother is in the 442nd Infantry. American soldiers like him deserve every advantage we can give them." The incident transformed the team. What had been a fascinating technical challenge now felt like a sacred duty, as Sanders wrote in his journal that night. "Today we nearly lost everything to carelessness. We won't get a second Zero. We won't get a second chance." The following morning, security protocols tightened further. Commander Arthur Graves used the incident to question Sanders' leadership, but Roy Grumman personally telephoned from Bethpage to express his confidence in the test pilot's team. 3 days later, with the smell of smoke still lingering faintly in the hangar, the Zero was finally ready for its first American test flight. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders stared at the ceiling of his quarters, the soft glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. Despite his reputation among fellow pilots as Iceman for his unwavering composure during test flights, tonight his mind raced with doubts. What if the Zero isn't airworthy? He whispered to the darkness. The captured Japanese fighter had been meticulously reassembled, but no American had ever flown one before. Was he about to climb into a death trap? The thought of mechanical failure at 5,000 feet made his stomach tighten. Eddie reached for his notebook, flipping through pages of calculations and observations. George Nakamura had assured him the engine was sound, but the Zero's lightweight construction concerned him deeply. He'd watched George tap on the fuselage, the metal so thin it flexed under minimal pressure. One wrong move could tear the wings clean off. "Am I risking my life on a hunch?" Sanders wrote in his journal, underlining the words twice. The brass wanted results, not excuses. Commander Graves was already circling like a vulture, ready to take over at the first sign of hesitation. Unable to sleep, he dressed and made his way to the hangar. The night guard nodded him through, used to the test pilot's odd hours. Inside, the Zero sat silent and ghostly under the dim lights, its red Hinomaru emblem still visible despite attempts to cover it with American markings. Sanders ran his hand along the control surfaces, checking each cable and connection for the 100th time. He opened the maintenance logs that Nakamura had meticulously kept, noting every repair and adjustment. The Japanese-American mechanic had become his most trusted ally in this endeavor, bridging cultural and technical gaps that might otherwise have doomed the project. "I can't let them down," he murmured, thinking of the pilots in the Pacific who face these machines daily without understanding their weaknesses. He calculated the odds in his head again. If the Zero performed as expected, the information would save countless American lives. If it failed, well, he'd chosen this profession knowing the risks. Sanders finally returned to his quarters as the first hints of dawn appeared. He managed a few hours of fitful sleep before his alarm jolted him awake. After a quick shower and a cup of bitter coffee, he walked to the airfield with renewed determination. The morning sun glinted off San Diego Bay as technicians performed final checks on the aircraft. Walt McIntyre from Grumman stood nearby, clipboard in hand, ready to document every observation. "Ready, Commander?" George asked, handing him his flight helmet. Sanders nodded, his earlier doubts not gone but transformed into focused caution. He climbed into the cockpit, settling into the unfamiliar seat of America's most feared enemy. "Let's see what she can do," he said, and reached for the starter. Dawn broke over San Diego Bay as Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders approached the captured Zero. The aircraft sat on the tarmac like an exotic bird far from home, its distinctive silhouette unmistakable, even under the American markings hastily painted for the test. "Weather conditions are optimal," George Nakamura reported, completing his final inspection. "Engine temperature normal. She's ready, Commander." Sanders nodded, his expression betraying none of the tension coiling in his stomach. This wasn't just any test flight. This was stepping into the enemy's mind, feeling what Japanese pilots felt when they dominated the Pacific skies. "Remember, if anything feels wrong, abort immediately." Walter McIntyre called from the edge of the runway, clipboard clutched tightly in his hands. The young engineer had spent 3 sleepless nights ensuring every component was flight-worthy. Sanders climbed into the cockpit, immediately struck by its Spartan design. No armoplating behind the seat, minimal instrumentation, every ounce dedicated to performance rather than pilot protection. He secured his harness and placed his hands on the control stick, feeling its unusual lightness. The Zero's engine coughed to life with a distinctive whine, higher pitched than American fighters, almost musical in its alien tone. Sanders taxied carefully, feeling the aircraft's eagerness through the controls. The moment of truth approached. With a deep breath, he pushed the throttle forward. The Zero leapt down the runway with startling acceleration, becoming airborne after a remarkably short roll. Sanders felt his heart hammer as the wheels left the ground. He was flying the enemy's most feared weapon. "I'm airborne," he reported calmly into his radio, masking the exhilaration flooding through him. Initial impression, extremely responsive. The test pilot banked gently left, then right. The controls were feather-light, almost twitchy, requiring the barest pressure to execute maneuvers that would demand firm handling in an American fighter. At 2,000 feet, he attempted his first steep turn. The Zero carved through the air with balletic grace, but as Sanders pushed the aircraft to higher speeds, he noticed something critical. The ailerons stiffened dramatically, refusing to respond with the same crispness they showed at lower velocities. Control surfaces becoming sluggish above 250 knots, he noted aloud for the recorder. Significant resistance in the ailerons. For the next 30 minutes, Sanders methodically explored the aircraft's handling envelope, logging every quirk, every vibration, every hint of weakness. Each discovery felt like unlocking a secret code, one that might save countless American lives. When he finally brought the Zero back to Earth with a gentle touchdown, a small crowd had gathered. The test pilot's face remained impassive, but his mind raced with implications. He now understood why Zero pilots relied so heavily on turning fights at moderate speeds. "How was it?" McIntyre asked eagerly, as Sanders climbed out. "It's beatable," the commander replied simply, "and I know exactly how." 24 flights followed over the next 6 weeks, each one pushing boundaries further than the last. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders meticulously documented every aspect of the captured Zero's performance, determined to extract every secret from the Japanese fighter. "We need to know exactly where this bird breaks," he told George Nakamura one morning as they prepared for another test. The mechanic nodded silently, his hands moving with practiced precision over the engine components. Sanders took the aircraft through maneuvers that would make even veteran pilots blanch. Negative-G dives that strained both machine and man. High-speed rolls that tested the structural integrity of the wings, and abrupt stalls that revealed the Zero's recovery characteristics. Each flight added crucial data to his growing understanding of the enemy's prized fighter. On the 19th flight, Sanders discovered something extraordinary. During a negative-G maneuver, the engine suddenly sputtered and died, plunging the cockpit into terrifying silence at 12,000 feet. The propeller windmilled uselessly as the aircraft began its descent. "Mayday, mayday," he radioed calmly, despite his racing heart. Engine failure in the Zero, attempting restart. For 15 agonizing seconds, Sanders fought with the controls, the ground rushing up to meet him. Then, as he pulled out of the negative-G condition, the engine coughed back to life. He nursed the aircraft back to North Island, landing with shaking hands, but a mind racing with implications. "The carburetor," Walter McIntyre exclaimed when Sanders described what happened. The engineer's eyes lit up with understanding. "Their float-type carburetor can't handle negative-G. It's starving the engine of fuel when inverted." This revelation was pure gold. American fighters with their fuel injection systems could dive straight down without losing power, a tactical advantage that could mean life or death in aerial combat. "We found it," Sanders told his team, barely containing his excitement. "The Achilles heel is real." That night, he wrote in his personal journal, "The Zero is a masterpiece of maneuverability, but fatally flawed. A pilot who knows its weaknesses can defeat it. American lives will be saved with this knowledge." The test pilot shared his findings with Roy Grumman via secure telephone the next morning. The engineer immediately grasped the significance. "We'll make sure every Hellcat pilot knows this," Grumman promised. "Dive away from a zero, and you've got the advantage." Sanders continued pushing the captured fighter to its limits, cataloging every weakness: the stiffening controls at high speeds, the lack of armor protection, the vulnerable fuel system. Each discovery was another weapon in America's arsenal, not of steel and explosives, but of knowledge. By the final test flight, Sanders had transformed from merely a pilot to something more: the man who understood the enemy's greatest weapon better than they did themselves. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders stood before a panel of stern-faced admirals in the dimly lit briefing room at North Island. His weathered hands guided a pointer across charts displaying the Zero's performance data, meticulously collected over dozens of test flights. "Gentlemen, the A6M isn't invincible," Sanders explained, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Its ailerons become sluggish above 300 knots, and the airframe cannot withstand sustained negative-G maneuvers." The brass exchanged skeptical glances. Rear Admiral Holloway leaned forward, his voice cutting through the room. "Commander, our boys need firepower, not fancy flying tricks. The solution is more guns, more armor." Sanders felt his jaw tighten. These men controlled the fate of thousands of pilots, yet they clung to outdated doctrine. He thought of the letters he'd written to families of fallen airmen, each one a personal failure in his mind. "Sir, with respect, we've lost too many good men trying to outgun the Zero in turning fights," he countered. "The data is conclusive. Vertical tactics, diving attacks followed by zoom climbs, exploit weaknesses we never knew existed until we had Koga's aircraft." Commander Arthur Graves cleared his throat from the back of the room. "Perhaps Lieutenant Commander Sanders is being overly cautious," he suggested smoothly. "The Pacific Theater demands aggressive action, not defensive maneuvering." Sanders recognized the political maneuvering. Graves had been angling for control of the test program for months, positioning himself as the bold alternative to Sanders' methodical approach. After the briefing, George Nakamura found Sanders staring at the Zero in the hangar, his expression troubled. "They didn't buy it, did they?" the mechanic asked, wiping grease from his hands. "Some did, not enough." Eddie ran his hand along the aircraft's wing. "This machine has killed hundreds of our pilots because we didn't understand it. Now we do, and they won't listen." Nakamura nodded thoughtfully. "My grandfather had a saying: the nail that stands up gets hammered down. Sometimes being right isn't enough." That night, Sanders worked late, compiling a new report. He included photographs of structural failures in the Zero's frame, comparative turning radius charts, and, most compelling, combat reports from the few pilots who had survived encounters by using vertical tactics. At dawn, he called Walt McIntyre at the Grumman plant. "Walt, I need your help. The brass won't listen to me, but they might listen to Grumman. Can you get Roy to back these findings?" "I'll do better than that," McIntyre replied. "I'll bring the evidence to Washington myself." Sanders hung up the phone, exhausted but resolute. The weight of every lost pilot pressed upon his shoulders, driving him forward. He would prove them wrong. He had to. The sprawling Grumman facility in Bethpage hummed with activity as engineers and mechanics worked tirelessly on what they hoped would become America's answer to the Zero. While Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders was pushing the captured Japanese fighter to its limits in San Diego, the F6F Hellcat was taking shape on Long Island, evolving from concept to combat-ready reality. Roy Grumman paced the factory floor, his brow furrowed as he examined the latest blueprints. The seasoned engineer had built his reputation on sturdy, reliable aircraft, but the Hellcat needed to be something more. It needed to be a Zero killer. When Walter McIntyre arrived from California with Sanders's detailed reports, Grumman cleared his schedule immediately. "These findings change everything," McIntyre explained, spreading Sanders's meticulous notes across the conference table. The young engineer's eyes reflected both exhaustion and determination. Since losing his son to a Japanese bombing raid, Walt had thrown himself into his work with almost religious fervor. Grumman nodded thoughtfully as he studied the data. "The Zero's fragility is our opportunity," he said, tapping a diagram of the Japanese fighter's fuel system. "No protection whatsoever." The team worked through the night, redesigning critical components. Self-sealing fuel tanks became a priority, unlike the Zero's vulnerable system that could burst into flames from a single tracer round. Armor plating around the cockpit was doubled, protecting the pilot at the cost of added weight. "Sanders says their ailerons freeze up at high speeds," McIntyre pointed out. "We need to ensure ours remain responsive." Each modification presented its own challenge. The additional armor and protection systems made the prototype heavier, requiring a more powerful engine. Grumman made the call to install the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 power plant, a decision that would prove crucial to the Hellcat's success. George Nakamura's insights on Japanese engine design, relayed through Sanders's reports, proved invaluable. The Japanese-American mechanic had identified specific weaknesses in the Zero's power system that the Hellcat team was determined to avoid. But bureaucracy threatened to slow progress. Navy procurement officers questioned the cost of each upgrade, while production managers warned about manufacturing delays. Grumman found himself fighting battles in boardrooms, while his engineers fought their own on the drafting tables. "Every day we delay is another day American pilots face those Zeros without equal equipment," McIntyre argued during a particularly heated meeting with Navy officials. The pressure mounted as reports from the Pacific detailed mounting casualties. Each telegram announcing another squadron decimated by the nimble Japanese fighters only intensified the urgency at Bethpage. By autumn of 1942, the first Hellcat prototype was taking shape, heavier than originally planned, but potentially more lethal. It embodied everything Sanders had learned from his dangerous dance with Koga Zero. Where the Japanese fighter was light and fragile, the Hellcat would be robust and survivable. Where the Zero faltered at high speeds, the American fighter would excel. The race against time continued, with lives hanging in the balance with each passing day. Behind the technical breakthroughs and test flights, a political battle was brewing that threatened the entire Zero program. Commander Arthur Graves, an ambitious officer with connections in Washington, began a calculated campaign to wrest control from Eddie Sanders. The rivalry wasn't just professional. Graves had coveted leadership of high-profile projects since their days at flight school. "Sanders is being excessively cautious," Graves wrote in a confidential memo to the Bureau of Aeronautics. "His methodical approach wastes precious time while our boys are dying in the Pacific." The commander's arguments gained traction among officials eager for faster results, especially those unfamiliar with the technical complexities involved in reverse engineering enemy aircraft. In a particularly damaging move, Graves arranged a demonstration for 3 visiting admirals, showcasing only the Zero's strengths while omitting Sanders' discoveries about its weaknesses. "We need aggressive tactics, not defensive maneuvers," he told them, implying that Eddie was missing the bigger picture. The pressure mounted when Sanders received notice that his authority was under review. George Nakamura found him late one evening in the hangar, silently staring at the Zero's cockpit. "They're going to shut us down before we finish," Eddie confided, his normally composed demeanor cracking. "Graves has convinced them we're moving too slowly." The mechanic nodded grimly. Having faced suspicion due to his Japanese heritage, he understood political vulnerability all too well. "Your records might save us," he suggested. "No one documents like you do." Sanders spent the next 48 hours compiling every flight log, test result, and engineering insight. His meticulous nature, often mocked by Graves as obsessive, became his strongest defense. The binder he assembled revealed a systematic approach that had already identified 17 critical weaknesses in the Zero's design. Just as the review board was convening, an unexpected ally emerged. Walt McIntyre had shared Sanders' findings with Roy Grumman, who recognized their value immediately. The respected engineer sent a strongly worded letter to the Navy Department, Lieutenant Commander Sanders' work represents the most thorough analysis of enemy aircraft capabilities in this war. Replacing in would set back the Hellcat program by months, if not longer. The combination of Sanders' detailed records and Grumman's endorsement tipped the scales. The board voted narrowly to maintain the current leadership structure, though they attached a timeline for completion that would keep everyone working around the clock. That evening, Eddie received a terse note from Graves. "You won this round. Don't expect another." The threat was clear, but Sanders merely filed the note with his other records. The program would continue, though hanging by the thinnest of threads. Despite the tight security measures, word of the Zero's capture had begun to spread beyond the confines of Naval Air Station North Island. In the spring of 1943, Japanese intelligence networks operating along the California coast caught wind of unusual activity. Fragments of information, whispers about a recovered aircraft, increased security at a specific hangar, the presence of a distinctive test pilot, began to coalesce into a troubling picture. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders first noticed something was amiss when military police doubled their patrols around the hangar complex. Without explanation, his security clearance was suddenly upgraded, and he was instructed to vary his routes to and from the base each day. "They're watching us," George Nakamura told him one evening as they reviewed engine performance data. The mechanic had intercepted suspicious glances from other personnel. His Japanese heritage, once valued for its technical insights, now made him a potential security liability in the eyes of some. Their fears materialized one foggy night when perimeter alarms blared across North Island. Armed guards surrounded the Zero's hangar as shadowy figures attempted to breach the eastern fence line. Gunfire erupted, echoing across the tarmac. By morning, base security had apprehended 2 men claiming to be maintenance workers. But their forged credentials and concealed cameras told a different story. "The Japanese know what we have," Sanders reported to his superiors the following day, "and they'll stop at nothing to compromise it." The incident transformed the test program overnight. The Zero was disassembled and relocated to a different facility under cover of darkness. Sanders and Nakamura found themselves working under the watchful eyes of counterintelligence officers. Their notes, once merely classified, were now handled with extraordinary precautions, transported in locked cases, and stored in safes between sessions. For Nakamura, the pressure became nearly unbearable. "Some people look at me like I'm the spy," he confided to Sanders during a rare moment alone. "My own brother is fighting in Europe with the 442nd, and still they wonder where my loyalties lie." Sanders placed a hand on his colleague's shoulder. "Your loyalty isn't what's keeping me up at night," he said. "It's what happens if we fail." The test pilot knew that every flight now carried dual risks, not just the physical dangers of pushing the captured fighter to its limits, but the strategic peril of what might happen if their findings were compromised. The race to understand the Zero's weaknesses and incorporate them into the Hellcat's design had become more than a technical challenge. It was now a matter of survival. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders sat hunched over his desk, surrounded by stacks of flight logs and hastily scribbled notes. The dim light of his desk lamp cast long shadows across the room as he meticulously compiled his findings into what would become the new combat doctrine for American fighter pilots across the Pacific. "Vertical tactics," he muttered to himself, underlining the phrase twice. "That's where we beat them." His reports, once viewed with skepticism by some brass, were now transforming pilot training throughout the Navy. The manuals being printed emphasized 3 critical principles: dive on the Zero from above, climb away when threatened, and never, under any circumstances, try to pern with the Japanese fighter. The Zero's lightweight frame gave it unmatched turning ability, but Sanders had discovered its fatal flaws during his test flights. At Naval Air Station Jacksonville, instructors drilled these principles into fresh-faced pilots daily. The same scene played out at Corpus Christi, where training squadrons spent hours practicing high-speed diving attacks followed by steep climbs that would stall a Zero, but allowed the heavier American fighters to escape. "Show me again," demanded a veteran instructor, watching as cadets simulated attacks using Sanders' tactics. "Remember, you're dead the moment you try to dogfight on their terms." Not everyone embraced the new approach. Commander Arthur Graves, still smarting from his failed attempt to take over the Zero program, led a faction of traditionalists who believed in aggressive turning engagements. "Sanders is making cowards of our boys," Graves complained to anyone who would listen. His influence led one training unit to modify the doctrine, emphasizing aggression over tactical discipline. The results were devastating. 8 pilots from that squadron were lost in their first engagement over the Solomon Islands, having abandoned vertical tactics for horizontal turning fights against experienced Zero pilots. George Nakamura was with Sanders when the report arrived. "They didn't follow your instructions," the mechanic said quietly, watching as the test pilot's face darkened with grief. "This is on me," Sanders replied, voice tight. "I should have been clearer." The painful losses forced a comprehensive revision of training materials. Walter McIntyre flew in from Bethpage to help Sanders develop simplified diagrams showing exactly how the Hellcat's power could be leveraged against the Zero's weaknesses. "Make it impossible to misunderstand," McIntyre insisted, his own grief over his son's death fueling his determination. The revised doctrine was brutally direct. The Zero will kill you in a turn, kill it in a dive. Within weeks, every pilot heading to the Pacific carried these words with them, not just as instruction, but as a mantra for survival. The doctrine, born from hundreds of dangerous test flights in an enemy aircraft, was saving American lives and turning the tide of the air war one dogfight at a time. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders' dedication to realism had transformed the test program, but that same commitment was about to extract a heavy personal toll. The morning sky over North Island glowed with promise as Sanders briefed his fellow pilots on the day's exercises. Among them was Lieutenant Jimmy Foster, a talented aviator with an easy smile who had volunteered to fly the captured Zero in a series of combat simulations. "Remember, we're not just flying, we're learning how to kill and how not to die," Sanders told the assembled pilots. His usually composed features tightened with intensity. The simulated dogfight began with textbook precision. Foster, piloting the Zero, demonstrated the Japanese fighters' remarkable low-speed maneuverability while the American pilots practiced vertical escape tactics. But 20 minutes into the exercise, something went terribly wrong. Foster attempted a tight turning climb that Sanders had specifically warned against. The Zero, pushed beyond its structural limits, shuddered violently. From his observation point, Sanders watched in horror as the aircraft's port wing buckled. The Zero spiraled downward, hitting the ground with a sickening thud before erupting into flames. The rescue team reached Foster quickly, pulling him from the wreckage before the fire consumed the cockpit entirely. He survived, but with severe burns and a shattered leg that would end his flying career. Sanders visited the hospital that evening, the antiseptic smell burning his nostrils as he walked the long corridor to Foster's room. The injured pilot lay swathed in bandages, his breathing labored. "This wasn't your fault, Commander," Foster whispered, seeing the guilt etched on Sanders's face. But Sanders knew better. Had he been clearer about the Zero's limitations? Had his push for combat authenticity gone too far? The questions haunted him as he drove back to base in silence. George Nakamura found Sanders later that night, still at his desk reviewing flight data. "You can't save everyone," the mechanic said quietly. "I can try," Sanders replied, not looking up from his notes. That night, Sanders wrote a comprehensive revision to the test protocols, adding additional safety parameters and more explicit warnings about the Zero's structural weaknesses. He included detailed notes about the accident, refusing to sanitize his own role in the tragedy. When Walt McIntyre received Sanders's updated report at the Grumman plant, he immediately recognized what it had cost the test pilot to write it. The engineer incorporated every safety recommendation into the Hellcat's design specifications, knowing each line had been written in blood and guilt. For Sanders, the mission had become deeply personal. Every pilot saved by his knowledge would be a small redemption for Foster's broken body. He vowed silently to get it right, not just for victory, but for everyone's sake. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning. Walter McIntyre's hands trembled as he read the words that would forever alter his life. His son, Lieutenant James McIntyre, had perished when Japanese bombers struck his destroyer in the Solomon Islands. The Grumman engineer folded the paper neatly, placed it in his breast pocket, and returned to his workbench without a word. That evening, Walt remained at the Bethpage plant long after others had gone home. Surrounded by blueprints and material samples, he channeled his raw grief into the one thing he could control, the armor that would protect other fathers' sons. He sketched furiously, calculating weight ratios and impact resistance with a fevered precision. "I found him asleep at his desk," Roy Grumman later told Eddie Sanders during a progress update. The man had developed an entirely new approach to our armor plating problem. McIntyre's innovation was brilliant in its simplicity, a layered alloy that dispersed impact energy while maintaining structural integrity. When tested against captured Japanese ammunition, the armor withstood direct hits from 20mm cannon fire that would have shredded the Zero's thin skin. "This isn't just metal," Walt explained to his team, dark circles under his eyes betraying his exhaustion. "This is the difference between a pilot coming home or not." His colleagues, many with loved ones in combat themselves, redoubled their efforts. Meanwhile, the first Hellcat prototype faced its own challenges. Test flights revealed an underpowered aircraft, quick but lacking the raw acceleration needed to catch a diving Zero. Sanders had emphasized this requirement repeatedly in his reports. American pilots needed to dictate engagement terms, not react to them. "The engine's not cutting it," Grumman declared after reviewing the data. "We need more horses under the hood." The solution came in the form of the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder behemoth producing 2,000 horsepower. Engineers worked around the clock to modify the airframe, strengthening load-bearing structures while incorporating McIntyre's armor innovations. When the redesigned prototype took flight in February 1943, the difference was immediately apparent. The aircraft leapt from the runway, climbing at nearly 3,000 feet per minute, significantly outperforming the Zero in vertical maneuvers, while maintaining the durability Sanders had insisted upon. "It's like comparing a thoroughbred to a workhorse," one test pilot remarked after landing. "Except our thoroughbred is wearing armor." For Walt, each successful test brought a measure of peace. During a rare moment of vulnerability, he confided in Nakamura while they inspected an engine mount. "My boy never had a chance against their planes," he said quietly, "but these pilots will." The mechanic nodded solemnly, understanding the weight behind those words. "Then we make sure this engine never fails them." The sun hung low over San Diego Bay as Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders pushed the captured Zero into a steep dive. He was attempting to recreate the exact conditions Japanese pilots would face when fleeing a Hellcat's superior firepower. Pulling up sharply at just 500 feet, the aircraft shuddered violently. The engine sputtered, then died. "Come on," Sanders muttered through gritted teeth, fighting the suddenly unresponsive controls. The ground rushed toward him with terrifying speed. At the last possible moment, the engine caught, allowing him to level out barely 50 feet above the scrubland, wingtip nearly grazing a stunted tree. Back at North Island, the near disaster had been witnessed by a visiting admiral. By afternoon, Sanders found himself standing rigidly before Captain Harrison, the base commander. "You're grounded, Eddie. Effective immediately." The test pilot's normally icy composure cracked. "Sir, with all due respect, we're weeks away from finalizing the tactical manual." And what good is a manual written by a dead pilot? Harrison slid a form across his desk. Medical evaluation and flight review. Standard procedure. Sanders stormed from the office, nearly colliding with George Nakamura in the hallway. The mechanic recognized the fury in his colleague's eyes. "Bad news?" George asked. "They've pulled me from the program," Sanders replied, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Pending review." That evening, Sanders paced his quarters, drafting impassioned letters to Naval Command. He argued that no other pilot understood the Zero's peculiarities as intimately as he did. Each flight had revealed crucial weaknesses that American pilots needed to exploit. Grounding him now would cost lives. Commander Arthur Graves wasted no time. By morning, he had already volunteered to take over the program, suggesting to superiors that Sanders had become emotionally compromised by his obsession with the enemy aircraft. Sanders found an unexpected ally in Walter McIntyre. The Grumman engineer, still carrying the grief of his son's death, placed a long-distance call to Roy Grumman himself. "Sanders is the only one who truly understands that plane," McIntyre insisted. "The data he's providing is saving our boys' lives." 3 tense days passed. Sanders haunted the hangar like a ghost, watching as others prepared the Zero for flights he wouldn't pilot. George worked quietly on the engine, occasionally glancing at his friend with concern. The reprieve came via telegram. Roy Grumman had personally vouched for Sanders, emphasizing the test pilot's irreplaceable expertise. Naval Command reluctantly reinstated him, though with stricter altitude restrictions. Sanders returned to the cockpit with renewed determination, but something had changed. The brush with both death and professional disgrace had left its mark. As he taxied the captured fighter down the runway for his next test, his hands trembled slightly on the controls, a vulnerability no one else would ever see. By June 1943, the culmination of countless hours in hangars, test flights, and engineering meetings finally materialized as the first production F6F Hellcats rolled off the assembly line at Grumman's Bethpage facility. Roy Grumman personally oversaw the final inspections, his weathered hands tracing the reinforced armor that had been Walt McIntyre's obsession since losing his son. "They're ready," Grumman said simply, watching as the sleek fighters were loaded onto aircraft carriers bound for the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders stood on the deck of the USS Essex, a knot of anticipation tightening in his stomach as the pilots, many of whom he'd personally trained, prepared for the Hellcat's combat debut over Marcus Island. These young men had absorbed his lessons, drilled endlessly on the tactics derived from his test flights in Koga Zero. "Remember, vertical maneuvers," he reminded a nervous ensign. "Never turn with them. Dive, climb, use your power." The battle that unfolded exceeded even Sanders' most optimistic projections. American pilots, once intimidated by the Zero's reputation, now pursued them with calculated aggression. The Hellcat's superior diving speed, rugged construction, and powerful engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 that McIntyre had insisted upon, transformed the balance of aerial combat. A pilot named Johnson returned with bullet holes across his wing, but a broad smile. "That armor saved my life," he told Sanders. "I took hits that would have torn a Wildcat to pieces." Back at North Island, George Nakamura received the combat reports with quiet satisfaction. The Japanese-American mechanic had endured suspicious glances throughout the project, but now his expertise with Japanese engine design had helped create their nemesis. 19-1, he murmured, studying the preliminary kill ratios. For every Hellcat lost, 19 Zeros downed. Commander Arthur Graves attempted to claim credit in Washington, sending memos highlighting his strategic oversight of the program. But the pilots knew better. In their letters and reports, Sanders' name appeared repeatedly, the man who had understood the enemy's machine well enough to defeat it. Walt McIntyre received a telegram at the Grumman plant. Armor performed beyond expectations. Stop. Pilots returning when they shouldn't have. Stop. Thank you. Stop. He pinned it beside the photo of his son. The reports continued flooding in from carriers across the Pacific. Pilots who had once feared the Zero now hunted it methodically, exploiting every weakness Sanders had documented. The psychological impact was perhaps even greater than the tactical advantage. American pilots now flew with confidence against an enemy they understood. For Sanders, watching the kill ratio climb, there was no celebration, only quiet vindication. One captured aircraft, one persistent test pilot, and hundreds of dedicated engineers had changed the course of the air war in the Pacific. By early autumn of 1943, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted dramatically. American factories across the nation hummed day and night, the assembly lines of Grumman's Bethpage plant churning out Hellcats by the hundreds. Each aircraft that rolled off the production line carried with it the invisible fingerprints of Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders and his team. Their meticulous work now translated into armor plating, engine performance, and combat tactics. "They're requesting more pilots than planes now," Roy Grumman remarked during a briefing, sliding a report across his desk to Sanders. "That's a problem I never thought we'd have." The kill ratios from the front lines told a story that even the most optimistic admirals hadn't dared predict. American pilots who had once approached Zero encounters with dread now actively sought them out, applying Sanders's vertical tactics with devastating effectiveness. For the men and women behind this transformation, there was a new sense of purpose. Walter McIntyre's lightweight armor alloy had proven its worth in combat, saving dozens of pilots who would have perished in earlier aircraft. The engineer kept a photograph of his fallen son on his workbench, occasionally touching it when reports of successful engagements arrived. "Your boy didn't die for nothing, Walt," Sanders told him during a rare visit to Bethpage. "Every Hellcat that comes back with bullet holes in the armor instead of the pilot, that's him living on." Perhaps most remarkable was the transformation of George Nakamura. The Japanese-American mechanic, once viewed with suspicion by many on the base, received the Navy's Meritorious Civilian Service Award for his contributions to the Zero analysis. The ceremony was small and without fanfare, security concerns still paramount, but the significance wasn't lost on anyone present. "They wanted me to say something," Nakamura told Sanders afterward, fingering the medal. "I just told them I fixed engines. That's all." Sanders, always restrained with his emotions, allowed himself a rare smile as the reports continued to flow in from carriers in the Pacific. 19 enemy aircraft downed for every Hellcat lost, a ratio that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Even Commander Arthur Graves, who had fought so hard to claim credit for the program, grudgingly acknowledged Sanders's role during a Pentagon briefing. The man's methods were unorthodox, he admitted to the assembled brass, but the results speak for themselves. For Sanders, watching as another squadron of Hellcats departed for the front, the victory wasn't measured in kill ratios or production numbers, but in understanding. They had looked into the mind of their enemy and found not just weakness, but wisdom. By August 1943, the skies over the Pacific had witnessed a remarkable transformation. The F6F Hellcat had established its dominance with a staggering 19-to-1 kill ratio against the once feared Zero. American pilots, who had previously approached combat with trepidation, now hunted their Japanese counterparts with newfound confidence and tactical superiority. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders stood on the tarmac at North Island, watching the latest squadron of Hellcats take off for deployment. The roar of the Pratt & Whitney engines filled him with a quiet pride. He recalled those first uncertain flights in Koga Zero, how each discovery had been translated into tactical advantage and engineering improvements. "They're beautiful machines," George Nakamura said, approaching from the hangar. The mechanic had become an indispensable part of the team, his knowledge of Japanese engineering proving invaluable throughout their journey. Sanders nodded. "And they're saving lives, our lives. Reports from the battles over Tarawa and Saipan confirmed what they had worked so hard to achieve. Pilots were executing the vertical tactics Sanders had developed, diving on Zeros rather than turning with them, exploiting the weaknesses he had meticulously documented. Walter McIntyre arrived that afternoon with the latest performance data. The engineer's innovations in armor plating had proven particularly effective, with pilots returning an aircraft that would have been lost before. "Roy sends his regards," Walt said, handing over a telegram. "Grumman's ramping up production to 300 units per month." In a quiet moment later that day, Sanders visited the memorial for Lieutenant Foster and the other test pilots who hadn't survived to see their work bear fruit. The weight of their sacrifice still hung heavy, but was now balanced by the knowledge that countless others would return home because of what they had learned. Commander Graves had eventually been reassigned after his political maneuvering backfired. The success of the program had vindicated Sanders and his methodical approach. That evening, as the sun set over San Diego Bay, Sanders, Nakamura, and McIntyre gathered for a rare moment of reflection. They spoke of Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, whose fatal crash had inadvertently changed the course of the air war. "One plane, one pilot, one mistake," Sanders mused. That's all it took. For him, the mission had transcended mere victory. It had been about understanding, seeing through an enemy's eyes to find not just weakness, but insight. The captured Zero hadn't just flown. It had revealed a philosophy of aerial combat that transformed American aviation. As night fell and the lights of the base twinkled on, the three men raised their glasses in silent toast. In the vast Pacific, the hunters had become the hunted, and history had pivoted on the axis of their work.